Sometimes the people we're meant to save end up saving us instead. In the worst blizzard of 1882, mountain trapper Reuben Carrigan finds a half-frozen woman wandering alone in the snow. She can barely speak but somehow leads him to a hidden cave he's never seen before. Inside, they discover an old settler camp with journals and belongings that reveal shocking secrets about Reuben's past. The woman isn't just lost, she's running from something terrible. Together, they uncover a connection between their lives that goes back generations. As the storm rages outside, Reuben must face the truth about his family while helping this mysterious woman find her voice again. What they discover in that cave will change everything they thought they knew about themselves. But what secret could connect a lonely mountain man to a woman running for her life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled like a living thing against the rocky walls of the cave, but inside, a peculiar warmth settled between the two strangers. Reuben Carrigan sat cross-legged on the stone floor, his weathered hands turning over a hand-carved wooden cross he'd found among the scattered belongings. The wood was smooth with age, darkened by decades of handling, and bore the simple craftsmanship of someone who'd worked with love rather than skill. He glanced across the small fire at the woman barely more than a girl, really, who'd led him to this place. She huddled in his spare coat, her dark hair hanging in damp tangles around a face that might have been pretty under better circumstances. Her lips were still blue from the cold, but her eyes held a clarity that spoke of intelligence and determination. "Name's Reuben," he said quietly, his voice rough from years of talking mostly to himself and the occasional trading partner. "Reuben Carrigan. Been living up here about 15 winters now." She looked up at him with those startling green eyes but said nothing. Her silence didn't feel hostile or fearful, more like a deliberate choice, as if words were precious things she couldn't afford to waste. The cave stretched deeper than he'd first realized. What had seemed like a simple shelter from the storm revealed itself to be something far more substantial. Ancient tool marks scarred the walls where someone had deliberately widened the natural opening. Wooden shelves, now sagging with age, lined one wall. A stone fire pit had been carved into the floor with remarkable skill, complete with a chimney hole that drew smoke up and out through some invisible passage. But it was the belongings that truly puzzled him. A wooden crate contained tinned goods so old their labels had faded to illegibility. Leather-bound books sat wrapped in oiled cloth, their pages still readable despite the years. Someone had lived here once, and not recently. Reuben had been trapping these mountains since 1867, when grief and guilt had driven him from the world below. He knew every ridge, every valley, every cave worth knowing. Or so he'd thought. This place existed not 50 yards from a trail he'd walked hundreds of times. Yet he'd never seen the vine-covered entrance until the woman had pushed through the greenery like she'd known it was there all along. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Through the cave mouth he could see snow falling so thick it looked like a white curtain had been drawn across the world. The temperature was dropping fast, the kind of cold that killed men who weren't prepared for it. "You can't stay out there," he said, more to himself than to her. "Not in this weather." She nodded slightly, acknowledgement rather than gratitude. There was something about her bearing that suggested she wasn't accustomed to accepting help, even when her life depended on it. Reuben had fled to these mountains to escape the weight of other people's needs, their expectations, their inevitable disappointments in him. After Margaret's death and the child they'd lost, he'd found the world below too full of reminders, too heavy with obligations he'd proven unable to meet. Up here, the only life he was responsible for was his own, and he'd grown comfortable with that arrangement. Yet here he sat, studying this stranger and feeling something he'd thought was dead stirring in his chest. Not attraction. Though she was comely enough under the road dirt and exhaustion, Something deeper than that, a recognition, perhaps, of someone else who carried burdens too heavy for easy conversation. He'd left his cabin that morning to check his trap lines before the storm hit. The blizzard had come down faster and harder than he'd expected, catching him still an hour's walk from home. He'd been looking for any kind of shelter when he'd spotted her through the swirling snow, a dark figure stumbling. Through drifts that reached her knees, her movements growing weaker with each step. Any decent man would have helped her, of course, but Reuben had stopped thinking of himself as particularly decent years ago. He'd approached her out of simple human obligation, expecting to guide her to his cabin, where he could warm her up and send her on her way once the weather cleared. He hadn't expected her to take the lead, moving through the storm with apparent purpose toward a destination he hadn't known existed. Now, as he watched her sort through the old belongings with careful, respectful hands, he found himself curious about her story. She moved like someone accustomed to taking care of herself, but her clothes, what he could see of them under his coat, spoke of a more refined background. Her hands were soft, not marked by the kind of hard labor that shaped most women's lives on the frontier. Whoever lived here, he said, gesturing to the organized belongings, they meant to come. Back. Food's still good, books are well preserved, can't have been gone more than a few years. She looked up at him again, and for a moment he thought she might speak. Instead, she reached into the wooden crate and withdrew something that made Reuben's breath catch in his throat. It was a daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame, the glass cracked but the image still clear. A man in a Union Army uniform stood beside a young woman in a simple dress. The man's face was familiar in a way that made Reuben's chest tight with old grief. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice sharper than he'd intended. She held it out to him, and he took it with hands that weren't quite steady. The photograph had been taken sometime during the war years, judging by the uniform and the formal pose. The man in the picture had Reuben's eyes, his strong jaw, the same stubborn set to his shoulders. "Thomas," Reuben whispered, running his thumb along the edge of the frame. "My brother Thomas." The woman leaned forward slightly, watching his face with an intensity that made him look up from the photograph. "You knew him?" he asked. She nodded slowly, and this time when she opened her mouth, words came out in a voice made rough by cold and disuse. "He was my father." The simple statement hit Reuben like a physical blow. He looked from the photograph to her face and back again, seeing now what he'd missed before. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, the way she held her head when she was thinking all echoes of the brother he'd lost to fever in 1863. "That's impossible," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. Thomas had been gone for months before his death, traveling on business he'd never fully explained. He could have met someone, could have... "What's your name?" Reuben asked quietly. "Violet," she said. "Violet Ashworth." The surname meant nothing to him, but that didn't matter. He could see Thomas in her features, now that he knew to look for it, could hear an echo of his brother's voice in her careful speech. "How old are you?" 19 this past spring." The numbers worked. Thomas had died in late 1863, which would place her birth sometime in 1864. If her mother had been pregnant when Thomas fell ill, "Why are you running?" he asked. Because it was clear. Now that's what she was doing. No young woman traveled alone through mountain wilderness in winter unless she was fleeing something worse than the cold. Violet looked down at her hands, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "They want me to marry Sheriff Harwick. He's already paid my guardian for the privilege." She lifted her eyes to meet his. "I'd rather die than let that man touch me." Reuben had heard of Harwick, a corrupt lawman who ruled the territory around Millfield with an iron fist and flexible morals. The kind of man who saw women as property and used his badge to legitimize his worst impulses. "What about your mother?" Reuben asked. "Is she dead these past 3 years?" "Consumption." Violet's voice held the flat tone of someone who'd learned to speak of loss without letting it destroy her. My guardian says the marriage will provide security, but I've seen how Sheriff Harwick treats his property. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain. But inside, Reuben felt something fundamental shifting in his carefully ordered world. He'd spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, other people's problems, family obligations, the messy complications that came with caring about someone other than himself. But looking at this girl who carried his brother's features and his brother's stubborn courage, he found his long-cultivated isolation crumbling like snow in springtime. "How did you know about this place?" he asked. "My mother told me stories," Violet said, "about the places she and my father used to meet before they were married. She said there was a hidden cave where they would go to be alone, where he'd carved their initials in the stone and promised to love her forever." Reuben looked around the cave with new eyes, seeing now what he'd missed before. Near the back wall, barely visible in the firelight, crude letters had been scratched into the stone. T.C. plus E. Thomas Carrigan and Elizabeth Ashworth. His brother had loved this woman, had married her in secret, and had died before ever knowing he had a daughter. "She never told you about me?" Reuben asked. "She said my father had family, but that they disapproved of the marriage. She thought it best to let sleeping ghosts rest." Violet managed a small smile. "She didn't know you were living up here like some mountain hermit." The gentle rebuke in her words made Reuben chuckle despite himself. "Suppose I do cut a rather wild figure these days. Your father, he was always the respectable one of the family, wore proper clothes, minded his manners, made sensible choices. What happened to him? Fever took him in '63. He'd been sick for weeks, talking about Elizabeth and how he needed to get back to her. We thought it was just delirium." Reuben shook his head. "If we'd known about you, about your mother, things might have been different." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire burned lower, and Reuben added another piece of wood from the stack someone had left years ago. Everything in this cave spoke of preparation, of someone planning to return. "Your mother," he said eventually. "She must have been quite a woman to capture Thomas's heart. He was always particular about his companions." "She was strong," Violet said simply, "stronger than anyone knew. She raised me by herself, taught me to read and write and think for myself. Said a woman needed to be able to stand on her own because men weren't always reliable." The words stung, not because they were unkind, but because they were true. Thomas had been reliable until fever claimed him. But what about the family who'd supposedly disapproved? What about Reuben himself, who'd been so buried in his own grief that he'd never thought to look for the woman his brother had loved? "She was right about that," he said quietly. "We Carrigan men haven't exactly distinguished ourselves in the dependability department." "She wasn't bitter about it," Violet said, "just practical. She said love was a fine thing when it lasted, but a woman needed skills and strength to survive when it didn't." Outside, the wind shifted, and snow began drifting through the cave mouth. Reuben moved to block the opening with a piece of canvas he'd found among the supplies, creating a more complete shelter. The temperature inside rose immediately, and Violet pushed back the hood of his coat, revealing the full extent of her dark hair and delicate features. She was beautiful, he realized, but it was a beauty tempered by intelligence and hardened by experience. This wasn't some sheltered girl playing at independence. This was a young woman who'd made a desperate choice and was prepared to live with the consequences. "How long have you been traveling?" he asked. 3 days. I left everything behind and started walking. I wasn't sure I could find this place, wasn't even sure it really existed. But Mother's stories were so detailed, so specific. She gestured around the cave. I had to try. 3 days in winter weather with minimal supplies. She was tougher than she looked. "What's your plan now?" Reuben asked. "You can't stay here indefinitely, and Harwick won't just give up and go away." "I know. she said. "But I needed time to think, to figure out what comes next. Mother left me some money, hidden away, enough to start over somewhere if I can get to it." "Where?" "Denver. She had arrangements with a bank there, said if anything ever happened to her, I should go to them." Violet looked up at him. "But that's weeks of travel, and winter's just starting. I'll have to wait for spring." Reuben studied her face in the firelight, seeing determination mixed with very reasonable fear. She'd made it this far on courage and desperation, but courage alone wouldn't get her through a Rocky Mountain winter. "You have any experience surviving in the wilderness?" he asked. "Some. Mother taught me what she could, and I've read every book I could find about frontier living. But reading about something and doing it are different things." That was honest, at least. Most people would have exaggerated their capabilities. The storm outside was weakening, the howling wind dropping to a steady moan. By morning, it might be possible to travel, though the snow would be deep and the going difficult. "My cabin's about an hour from here," Reuben said carefully. "It's warm, well-stocked, and hidden enough that casual searchers wouldn't find it. You could stay there while you figure out your next move." Violet looked at him for a long moment, weighing his offer against whatever alternatives she'd been considering. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't know me, don't owe me anything." "You're Thomas's daughter," he said simply. "That makes you family, whether either of us wants it or not." She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face completely. "I'd be grateful for the help," she said, "and I'll work for my keep. I'm not afraid of labor." "We'll figure something out," Reuben said. "For now, you need rest. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you somewhere safe and warm." As Violet arranged the old blankets into a makeshift bed, Reuben found himself staring into the fire and wondering how his carefully ordered life had suddenly become so complicated. This morning, he'd been a hermit with nothing more pressing to worry about than trap lines and firewood. Tonight, he was responsible for a 19-year-old girl who was fleeing a forced marriage and carrying enough determination to walk into a blizzard rather than submit. But as he watched her settle down to sleep, trusting him enough to close her eyes in his presence, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. The sense that maybe, just maybe, he might be able to do some good in this world after all. The wooden cross lay beside him on the stone floor, its smooth surface reflecting the firelight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new responsibilities he wasn't sure he was ready to shoulder. Tonight, though, he had a fire to tend and a family member to protect. It wasn't much, but it was more purpose than he'd had in longer than he cared to remember. Dawn broke grey and cold over the mountains, the storm having exhausted itself sometime during the night. Reuben woke to find Violet already stirring the embers of their fire back to life, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to early mornings and necessary tasks. "Sleep well?" he asked, stretching muscles stiff from a night on stone. "Well enough." She glanced toward the cave mouth where pale light filtered through the canvas barrier. "The storm's passed. Mostly. There'll be deep snow, but we can make it to my cabin if we're careful." He began gathering his scattered gear, then paused. "Unless you'd rather stay here longer?" "No," she said quickly, then caught herself. "I mean, this place is special because of my parents, but it's not meant for long-term shelter. And if anyone comes looking, she didn't need to finish." The cave's vine-covered entrance had hidden it for years, but a determined search would eventually uncover it. Better to move while they could. As they prepared to leave, Violet moved deeper into the cave, drawn by something Reuben had missed in last night's firelight. Behind a curtain of hanging roots, the passage continued into the mountain. "There's more," she called, softly. Reuben joined her, holding a burning branch as a torch. The passage opened into a smaller chamber, this one clearly used for storage. Wooden crates lined the walls, and the air smelled of old leather and preserved food. "Your parents weren't the only ones to use this place," he observed. Violet knelt beside an ornate trunk, its brass fittings tarnished with age. This wasn't here in Mother's stories. The trunk was unlocked. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a collection of items that made Reuben's breath catch. A family Bible with entries dating back to the 1840s. A bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. And at the bottom, something that made his hands tremble as he lifted it free. It was a faded family photograph, larger and more formal than the damaged daguerreotype they'd found the night before. But this one showed a different scene entirely, a wedding party posed in front of a small church. The bride wore a simple but elegant dress, her face radiant with happiness. The groom stood beside her in his finest clothes, one hand protectively placed on her shoulder. Reuben recognized the groom immediately. Thomas, but Thomas as he'd never seen him, young, hopeful, completely in love. The woman beside him was clearly Violet's mother, beautiful and dignified, holding a small bouquet of mountain flowers. But it was the other figures in the photograph that made Reuben's world tilt sideways. Standing beside the bride was a woman he recognized as Sarah Millfield, wife of the banker who'd handled Thomas's affairs after his death. And beside Thomas stood a man Reuben had met only once but would never forget, Judge Morrison, the territorial magistrate who'd overseen the settlement of Thomas's estate. They knew, Reuben whispered. They all knew about the marriage. Violet leaned closer, studying the faces. That woman there, I've seen her before. She came to Mother's funeral, said she was an old friend. She seemed sad, but also angry about something. Sarah Millfield. Her husband handled Thomas's business dealings. Reuben's mind raced through the implications. If they knew about the marriage, knew about you, then why? He stopped, a terrible possibility forming in his thoughts. What is it? Violet asked. Thomas left a will. I was named executor, but the lawyer said there were no surviving family members. The estate was divided between some charitable organizations, and he looked up at her sharply. When did your mother die? October of 1879, 3 months after Thomas's will was finally settled. 3 months after a substantial inheritance was distributed to people who had no legal claim to it. Reuben sat back on his heels, the full scope of the deception becoming clear. You should have inherited everything, the land, the business interests, the money, all of it. Violet stared at the photograph, understanding dawning in her green eyes. They stole it. They knew about me, and they stole my inheritance. It's worse than that, Reuben said grimly. Your guardian, who is he? Judge Morrison. He was appointed after Mother died, said it was temporary until I came of age. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Morrison hadn't just stolen Violet's inheritance, he'd positioned himself to control her completely. The forced marriage to Sheriff Harwick would legitimize his theft, giving Harwick legal claim to anything that might surface later. We need to get out of here, Reuben said, standing abruptly, if they're willing to go this far to cover their tracks. The sound of horses outside cut off his words. Multiple riders, moving carefully through the snow but getting closer. Violet grabbed his arm. Someone's coming. Reuben moved to the cave mouth and peered through a gap in the canvas. 3 men on horseback were picking their way up the trail, their breath steaming in the cold air. The lead rider wore a badge that glinted in the morning sun. Harwick, Violet breathed, recognizing him even at a distance. How did they find this place so quickly? Reuben muttered. They didn't find it, Violet said, her voice hollow with realization. They knew where to look. Someone told them about Mother's stories. Sarah Millfield, it had to be. She'd attended the funeral, had probably heard Violet mention the hidden cave where her parents used to meet. When Violet disappeared, Harwick would have questioned everyone who'd known her mother. Back passage, Reuben said quietly. Is there another way out? They retreated into the storage chamber, but a quick search revealed only solid stone walls. They were trapped. Miss Ashworth, Harwick's voice echoed off the rocks outside. I know you're in there. Come out peaceable and we can discuss this like civilized people. Reuben touched Violet's shoulder, indicating she should stay silent. Her eyes were wide with fear but also blazing with anger. "Your guardian is worried sick about you," Harwick continued, his tone falsely reasonable. "Running off in a blizzard like some kind of wild animal. What would your dear mother think?" The calculated cruelty of invoking her mother made Violet's hands clench into fists. "I've got men posted on every trail down the mountain," Harwick called. "Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Make this easy on yourself." Reuben was thinking furiously. The cave had only one entrance, but it was narrow enough that a single man with a rifle could hold it against several attackers. The problem was supplies. They had enough food for maybe a day, and winter was just beginning. "You in there with her, mountain man?" Harwick's voice took on a harder edge. "Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime. Course, accidents happen in these mountains. Easy for a man to disappear, never to be found." The threat was clear. Harwick wasn't planning to take prisoners. Violet moved closer to Reuben, speaking in a whisper so low he had to lean down to hear her. "There's something else," she said. "In the trunk." She led him back to the ornate chest and reached beneath the Bible to withdraw a leather portfolio tied with legal ribbon. Inside were documents, deeds, bank papers, and what appeared to be a copy of Thomas's actual will. "Mother hid these before she died," Violet whispered. "Said if anything happened to her, I should find them and take them to the territorial governor in Denver." Reuben scanned the papers by torchlight. It was all there, proof of the marriage, documentation of the inheritance, evidence of the fraud that had robbed Violet of her birthright. With these documents, she could reclaim everything that had been stolen from her, if they lived long enough to use them. "Got to be getting cold in there," Harwick called. "Why don't you come out and warm yourselves by our fire? I promise we'll treat you real gentle-like." One of his men laughed, a sound that made Reuben's blood run cold. "He's not going to let us walk away from this," Reuben said quietly. "Not now that we know the truth." Violet nodded, her face pale but determined. "Then we fight." "You don't understand. There are 3 of them, probably more, waiting at the base of the mountain. We have 1 rifle and limited ammunition." "But we have this," she said, holding up the portfolio. "This is what they're really afraid of. Not me running away from a marriage, the proof that they're thieves and murderers." She was right. The documents changed everything. Harwick wasn't just pursuing a runaway bride. He was trying to eliminate witnesses to a massive fraud. "Can you shoot?" Reuben asked. "Mother taught me. I'm not expert, but I can hit what I aim at if it's close enough." "Getting mighty quiet in there," Harwick called. "Don't make me come in after you." Reuben moved to his pack and withdrew his rifle, checking the load and counting his spare ammunition. Enough for a short fight, but not a prolonged siege. "Here's what we're going to do," he said quietly. "I'm going to create a distraction, draw them away from the entrance. When I do, you take these documents and run. Follow the ridgeline north until you hit the old mining road, then head for the settlement at Pine Creek. I won't leave you here to die for me," Violet said firmly. "You're not leaving me to die. You're making sure those documents reach someone who can use them. That's the only way this ends with justice, instead of 3 bodies in an unmarked grave. There has to be another way. Miss Ashworth." Harwick's voice was losing its false patience. "My patience is wearing thin. Come out now, or we're coming in." Reuben gripped Violet's shoulders, looking directly into her eyes. "You want to honor your mother's memory. You want to make sure Thomas didn't die for nothing? Then you take those papers and you fight this the right way. Legal-like, where they can't just shoot their way out of the consequences." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she nodded. "What about you?" "I've been running from responsibility for 15 years, he said. "Maybe it's time I stood and faced it." The sound of boots on stone echoed from the cave mouth. Harwick had run out of patience. "When I start shooting, you go," Reuben whispered. "Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Just run." Violet clutched the portfolio to her chest. "Uncle Reuben." "Go save our family's honor," he said simply. Then he picked up his rifle, checked the action one final time, and prepared to hold the line against odds that would have made a younger man think twice. But Reuben Carrigan was no longer a young man running from his failures. Today, he was an uncle protecting his niece, a brother honoring his memory, and a man finally ready to pay the price that honor demanded. The first shot echoed through the cave like thunder, followed immediately by shouted curses from outside. Reuben had put his bullet exactly where he'd intended, close enough to Harwick's head to make the man dive for cover, far enough away to avoid making this a killing matter just yet. "That's your only warning," Reuben called out. "Next one won't be so generous." In the confusion that followed, Violet slipped through the back passage with the portfolio clutched against her chest. The narrow opening led to a crack in the cave wall that Reuben had spotted earlier, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. "You're making a big mistake, Mountain Man," Harwick's voice came from behind a boulder. "This doesn't concern you." "Girl's my niece," Reuben replied, working the bolt on his rifle. "Makes it my concern." A moment of silence. Then, "Your niece? That's impossible. Violet Ashworth has no living relatives." "According to who? Your friend Judge Morrison?" Reuben's laugh held no humor. Funny how Thomas Carrigan's will forgot to mention his wife and daughter, almost like someone wanted to keep that information quiet. Another shot rang out, this one striking the cave wall near Reuben's position. Harwick was done talking. Reuben returned fire, keeping the men pinned down while listening for sounds of Violet's escape. The crack in the cave wall led to a series of narrow passages that wound through the mountain old water channels, carved by centuries of snowmelt. If she could navigate them without getting lost, they would bring her out nearly a quarter-mile down the slope, well beyond Harwick's perimeter. "Brennan," Harwick shouted to one of his men, "circle around back. See if there's another way out of this hole." Reuben smiled grimly. By the time Brennan found the exit passage, Violet would be long gone. The girl was tougher and smarter than Harwick realized. But as the minutes stretched on, Reuben's situation grew more precarious. He had perhaps a dozen rounds left, and Harwick's men were beginning to coordinate their movements, taking turns keeping him pinned while the others maneuvered for better positions. "Found something, Sheriff," Brennan's voice echoed from somewhere behind the cave. "Looks like a crack in the rock face. Could be a way in or out." "Damn." Reuben had hoped for more time. "Check it," Harwick ordered. "But be careful. Mountain Man might have friends waiting." Reuben used the temporary lull to examine what Violet had left behind in her haste. Among the scattered contents of the trunk, a leather-bound journal caught his eye. The cover was worn smooth by handling, and when he opened it, he recognized Thomas's careful handwriting immediately. The first entry was dated May 1862, just after Thomas had returned from a business trip to Colorado Territory. But as Reuben read, he realized it hadn't been business at all. Thomas had fallen in love. "Met the most remarkable woman today," Thomas had written. "Elizabeth Ashworth, daughter of a mining engineer. Beautiful, certainly, but more than that, intelligent, spirited, unafraid to speak her mind. Father would disapprove, of course. Her family has no money, no social standing. But when she laughs, the whole world seems brighter." Reuben flipped through the pages, watching his brother's courtship unfold in careful script. Thomas had been cautious at first, aware that their father would never approve of a match with someone so far beneath their family's social expectations. But love had won out over prudence. "We were married today in a small ceremony," read an entry from September 1862. "No family present, save for Elizabeth's friend Sarah as witness. Judge Morrison performed the service. He owed me a favor from some legal work I'd done." Elizabeth was radiant. "I've never been so happy or so terrified in my life." A rifle shot brought Reuben's attention back to the present. Harwick was getting impatient. "Sheriff's getting antsy in there," one of the men called out. "Want me to rush him?" "Negative," Harwick replied. "Let him sweat." He's got nowhere to go, and we've got all day." But Harwick was wrong about that. As Reuben continued reading, he discovered that Thomas had been far more careful than anyone realized. The journal contained detailed maps of cache sites throughout the mountains, places where Thomas had hidden supplies, money, and copies of important documents. "Elizabeth is with child," Thomas had written in early 1863. "We've decided to tell no one until after the baby arrives. Too many people would use this knowledge against us, but I've made preparations. If anything happens to me, Elizabeth will be provided for." The preparations were extensive. Thomas had established accounts in Denver under Elizabeth's name, hidden gold and silver in locations marked clearly in his journal, even arranged for trusted allies to help if needed. He'd planned for every contingency except the one that had actually claimed him a simple fever that turned deadly before anyone realized how sick he was. "Getting mighty quiet in there," Harwick called. "Hope you're not planning anything foolish." Reuben studied the maps in Thomas's journal. One cache site was marked less than a mile from their current position, a shallow cave near the old mining road where Thomas had hidden emergency supplies and a substantial amount of money. If Violet had reached the exit passage safely, she would pass close to that location. Another gunshot echoed through the cave, closer this time. Harwick's men were probing his defenses, testing his response time and accuracy. "Found the exit hole," Brennan shouted from outside. "Narrow as a snake's den, but someone definitely went through recent-like. Want me to follow?" "Negative," Harwick replied. "Girl's probably halfway down the mountain by now. We'll deal with her later. Right now, I want that mountain man alive. He knows things." The words sent a chill down Reuben's spine. Harwick wasn't planning to kill him quickly. He wanted information first, which meant Violet had time to reach safety, but also meant Reuben was in for a long, unpleasant conversation if he was captured. "Listen, Carrigan," Harwick called, apparently having worked out Reuben's identity. "I know who you are now. Thomas Carrigan's hermit brother, hiding up here like some kind of wild animal. You want to know what really happened to Thomas?" Reuben didn't respond, but he listened. "Your brother was getting too curious about territorial land deals, asking questions about mining rights and water access. Made some powerful people nervous. That fever that killed him came on mighty sudden after he had dinner with Judge Morrison. The implication hit Reuben like a physical blow. Thomas hadn't died of natural causes, he'd been poisoned. Course, we can't prove nothing after all these years," Harwick continued, his voice carrying false sympathy. "But a man might wonder about the timing. Thomas dies just when he's becoming inconvenient, leaves behind a secret family nobody knows about, and all his assets get redistributed to his friends." Reuben's grip tightened on his rifle. Everything was starting to make sense now. The rushed settlement of Thomas's estate, the convenient ignorance about Elizabeth and Violet, the years of silence from people who should have been family friends. "You killed him," Reuben said quietly. "Now that's a serious accusation," Harwick replied. "The kind of thing that could get a man in real trouble if he spread it around without proof." "I've got proof. That journal contains everything: names, dates, bank records, cache locations." Thomas documented everything he suspected. A longer silence this time. When Harwick spoke again, his voice had lost its false joviality. "In that case, we definitely need to have a conversation. Throw out your rifle and come out peaceful-like. Make this easy on yourself." Reuben glanced at Thomas's journal, memorizing the location of the nearest cache site. Violet would need those resources if she was going to fight this legal battle properly. But first, she needed time to get clear of the immediate danger. "Tell you what, Sheriff," Reuben called back. "Give me 5 minutes to consider your generous offer. Man ought to have time to make peace with his maker before surrendering." 5 minutes, Harwick agreed. "Then we're coming in, whether you're ready or not." Reuben used the time to tear several pages from Thomas's journal, the maps showing cache locations and the most damaging evidence about the conspiracy. He wrapped them in oiled cloth and stuffed the packet into his boot, where it would stay hidden even if he was searched. The rest of the journal he placed carefully back in the trunk, along with the photograph and other family memorabilia. If he didn't survive this, perhaps someday another member of the Carrigan family would find these treasures and understand the truth about Thomas's death. When the 5 minutes were up, Reuben made his choice. He couldn't outfight 3 armed men, but he could buy Violet more time, and perhaps learn something useful about their enemies. "Coming out," he called, placing his rifle on the ground and stepping into the pale morning light with his hands raised. Sheriff Harwick stood waiting with a smile that promised nothing good. Sheriff Harwick's smile never reached his eyes as his men bound Reuben's hands behind his back with rough rope. The cold mountain air bit through Reuben's coat, but he barely noticed. His attention was focused on the ornate brass compass one of Harwick's men had pulled from his pack, the same compass his father had carried during his years, helping escaped slaves find freedom along the Underground Railroad. "Well, well," Harwick said, examining the compass with interest. "Benjamin Carrigan's old navigation tool. Your daddy was quite the humanitarian, wasn't he? Always helping folks find their way to better places." The casual way Harwick handled the family heirloom made Reuben's jaw clench. "You know about my father? Know about him? Hell, I arrested him twice back in Kansas. Course, we could never make charges stick. Old Ben was too smart, too careful. Always seemed to know when the law was coming." Harwick's smile turned predatory. "Wonder where he got his information. My father was a good man who helped people in need. Your father was a criminal who broke federal law and cost decent folks their property." Harwick pocketed the compass. "But I'm not interested in old history. I want to know about that girl's plans." "What plans? She's running from a forced marriage. That's hardly a criminal conspiracy." Harwick backhanded him across the face, the blow sharp enough to split his lip. "Don't play stupid with me, Carrigan. She didn't just run, she knew exactly where to come, knew about this cave, knew about the documents hidden here. Someone's been planning this for a long time." Blood ran down Reuben's chin, but he kept his expression neutral. "Maybe her mother told her stories about the place. Women do, that pass down family history." "Family history?" Harwick laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Is that what you're calling it? Your brother's whore and her bastard daughter?" The insult hit its mark. Reuben lunged forward despite his bound hands, only to be stopped by the rifle barrel. One of Harwick's men pressed against his throat. "Easy there, mountain man," the deputy said. "Sheriff's just making conversation." "Thomas and Elizabeth were legally married," Reuben said quietly. "I saw the photograph, the documentation. Judge Morrison performed the ceremony." "Morrison performed a lot of ceremonies," Harwick said. "Doesn't mean they were all legitimate. Amazing what people will believe when they want something bad enough." But Reuben caught something in Harwick's tone, a forced casualness that suggested he was fishing for information rather than stating facts. The sheriff knew the marriage was real. He was trying to determine how much Reuben understood about the larger conspiracy. "Where is she headed?" Harwick asked, changing tactics. "I don't know. Girl barely said 10 words to me before you showed up. Come now, Carrigan. You're Thomas's brother, she's his daughter. You expect me to believe there was no family reunion, no sharing of secrets and plans? We just met yesterday. Hard to have much of a reunion in one night." Harwick studied his face for a long moment, then nodded to his men. "Brennan, check that back passage again. See if you can track which direction she went. Wilkes, search the cave thoroughly. I want every scrap of paper, every hidden compartment." As the men spread out to follow orders, Harwick settled himself on a boulder facing Reuben. The sheriff pulled out a cigar and took his time lighting it, clearly planning to make this a lengthy conversation. "You know what I think happened here?" Harwick said, blowing smoke into the cold air. "I think Thomas left more than just love letters and photographs in this cave. I think he left instructions, maybe even resources for his precious Elizabeth and her daughter." Reuben kept his expression blank, but internally he was impressed by Harwick's reasoning. The man was corrupt and cruel, but he wasn't stupid. "Problem is," Harwick continued, "Elizabeth's been dead for years. So, if Thomas did leave something behind, who told Violet where to find it? Who's been planning this escape route? Maybe the girl figured it out herself. She seems intelligent enough. Oh, she's intelligent all right, smart enough to disappear from her guardian's house without leaving a trace. Smart enough to travel 3 days through winter wilderness. Smart enough to find a cave that's been hidden for 20 years. Harwick leaned forward. That's not just intelligence, Carrigan. That's preparation. From deeper in the cave came Wilkes's voice. Sheriff, you need to see this. Harwick stood, gesturing for his remaining deputy to keep watch over Reuben. Inside the cave, Wilkes had discovered the hidden storage chamber and was examining the scattered contents of the trunk. Looks like they found what they came for, Wilkes reported. Trunk's been searched, documents removed, but they left some interesting things behind. Reuben couldn't see what Wilkes was showing Harwick, but he could guess. The photograph of the wedding party, the family Bible with its record of births and deaths, Thomas's personal belongings, all evidence of the conspiracy to steal Violet's inheritance. Well, well, Harwick's voice echoed from inside the cave. Seems our little bird flew away with more than just her freedom. When Harwick emerged, his expression had hardened considerably. Whatever he'd seen in that trunk had confirmed his worst fears. Legal documents, he said without preamble. Proof of marriage, inheritance claims, probably copies of your brother's real will. The girl didn't just run away from a wedding, she's planning to challenge the entire estate settlement. Good for her, Reuben said. If people stole what was rightfully hers. Nothing was stolen, Harwick interrupted. Everything was handled according to territorial law, overseen by duly appointed officials, distributed according to proper legal procedures. Procedures that ignored the existence of Thomas's wife and daughter. Procedures that dealt with the facts as they were known at the time. Harwick's voice took on the practiced tone of a man reciting rehearsed lies. If new information has come to light, there are proper channels for addressing such matters. Channels that happen to be controlled by the same people who benefited from the original fraud. Harwick's cigar glowed as he took a long draw. You know what your problem is, Carrigan? You're thinking like your father, always assuming the worst about legitimate authority, always looking for conspiracy where there's just honest mistake. My father helped people who were being oppressed by unjust laws. Your father helped criminals escape the consequences of their actions. Just like you're doing now, harboring a fugitive from lawful marriage proceedings. Lawful? Reuben laughed bitterly. Since when is it lawful to force a woman into marriage? Even out here, a woman has the right to refuse, not when she's been legally promised by her guardian. Judge Morrison has full authority over Violet's personal and financial affairs until she reaches majority or marries. Those are the terms of her mother's will. Something cold settled in Reuben's stomach. You're saying Morrison controls her inheritance even if the marriage doesn't happen? I'm saying Morrison has been appointed to act in her best interests. Marriage to a respectable lawman represents security and protection for a young woman with substantial assets. The picture was becoming clearer now. Morrison hadn't just stolen Violet's inheritance, he'd positioned himself to control it permanently. If she married Harwick, her assets would pass to her husband under territorial law. If she remained single, Morrison retained control as her guardian. Either way, she would never see a penny of what Thomas had left her. She's 19, Reuben said. Surely she reaches majority soon. Territorial law is quite specific about the age of majority for women of substantial means, Harwick said smoothly. 21, or marriage, whichever comes first. Judge Morrison is simply ensuring she makes the right choice. 2 more years. 2 more years of Morrison's control, 2 more years for the conspiracy to solidify their theft, 2 more years for evidence to disappear or be destroyed. Of course, Harwick continued, if something were to happen to the girl, an accident in the wilderness perhaps, or an encounter with hostile Indians, well, tragic as that would be, it would certainly simplify matters for everyone involved. The threat was unmistakable. Violet wasn't just fighting for her inheritance anymore. She was fighting for her life. "Here's what's going to happen," Harwick said, standing and dropping his cigar in the snow. "You're going to tell me where she's headed and what resources she might have access to. In exchange, I'll make sure her death is quick and relatively painless." "And if I don't?" Harwick's smile returned, cold and hungry. "Then we'll track her down anyway, and when we catch her, I'll let my boys have some fun before we finish this business. Winter's been long and lonely, if you catch my meaning." Reuben met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Go to hell." "Wrong answer," Harwick said, nodding to his deputy. The rifle butt caught Reuben behind the ear, sending him sprawling into the snow. As darkness closed over his vision, his last conscious thought was of the compass his father had carried, a tool for helping lost souls find their way to freedom. Now it was Violet who was lost, and Reuben who might have failed to help her find safety. But the compass also reminded him of something else. His father had never given up, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed. Benjamin Carrigan had spent years fighting unjust laws and corrupt officials, helping people escape situations that seemed impossible. As consciousness faded, Reuben held on to that memory. If he survived this, he would follow his father's example. He would find a way to help Violet reclaim what was rightfully hers, and he would make these men pay for their crimes.